the silent Defiance. The transmission chamber on board the UNSS Revelation felt smaller than Commander James Cross remembered. Perhaps it was the weight of what was about to happen that made the walls seem to close in. Through the massive viewport, the Sovereign Assembly's flagship hung in space like a predator biding its time, a geometric nightmare of sharp angles and cold, unflinching design. It was the size of a small moon, bristling with weapon systems that could reduce entire worlds to ash with a single command. Humanity had known about its existence for only 2 months. Learning that it now orbited Earth had changed everything. Cross stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform, the blue and gold of Earth's United Space Command, feeling inadequate against the magnitude of this moment. Behind him, his core advisory team shuffled with barely contained anxiety. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, humanity's lead xenopsychologist, kept running her fingers through her hair. Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, the tactical officer, had been staring at the same readout on his console for the past 10 minutes without blinking. Captain Luis Mendez, the communications specialist, was the only one who seemed remotely composed, though Cross could see the slight tremor in her jaw that betrayed her fear. "They've sent the formal demands," Mendez said quietly, not turning from her station, Channel 7, demanding a response within 24 hours. Cross took a breath and activated the communication feed. The face that materialized before them was not what humans would call beautiful. The being that called itself Supreme Coordinator Vextar had skin that resembled burnished metal, features that were almost perfectly symmetrical in a way that seemed deliberately calculated to inspire awe, rather than comfort. Its eyes held no warmth, only the cold assessment of a creature that had conquered 1,000 worlds and found them all wanting. The voice that came through the speakers was smooth, articulate, and utterly devoid of mercy. "I am Supreme Coordinator Vextar of the Sovereign Assembly. Your species has developed the capacity for interstellar travel, which we acknowledge. However, advancement in technology does not translate to advancement in civilization. You are children playing with fire." Cross forced himself to maintain eye contact with the recording, though of course Vextar wasn't speaking directly to him. This was a broadcast message, the same one being sent to every corner of Earth. "The Sovereign Assembly maintains order across 10,000 star systems. We do this through strength, through unity, and through the understanding that the young and unruly must be guided toward enlightenment. You humans of Earth have 3 options. First, you can submit to our authority, become a protected species, and contribute your resources to the greater good. We estimate that your world can sustainably provide 30% of its rare isotopes, full access to your genetic database for assessment, and an initial population transfer of 500,000 of your strongest individuals to serve the Assembly." Okonkwo made a small sound of distress. Rivera's hand clenched into a fist. Mendez's professionalism cracked for just a moment, her eyes widening with shock. Vextar continued as if describing the weather. "Second, you can refuse, in which case you will be considered a rogue civilization. Trade with any Assembly member world will be forbidden. The same will be true in reverse. No species may trade with you or provide aid. You will be isolated, forced to watch from the darkness as the galaxy advances without you. Third, and I say this with no pleasure, you can resist, which would make you a threat to galactic peace. We would have no choice but to neutralize that threat permanently." The message ended. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "That's extortion," Rivera finally said, his voice tight. "That's colonization by another name." "It's been their way for 3,000 years, Okonkwo said, pulling up data on the main view screen. "I've been analyzing the broadcast from a cultural perspective. The Assembly has maintained dominion through fear and subjugation. They don't even see themselves as oppressors. They genuinely believe they're bringing order to chaos. It's a god complex on a galactic scale." Cross moved to the viewport, staring out at the Assembly flagship. Somewhere on that massive vessel, Vextar and other like-minded beings were confident that Earth would submit. They had conquered so many worlds, demanded so many tributes that they couldn't imagine a species actually saying no. That arrogance might be the only advantage humanity had. "What if we could show them something?" Mendez said suddenly. "Something that proves we're not just another primitive species to be added to their collection?" "We don't have the military strength," Rivera said flatly. "Their flagship alone has more firepower than our entire fleet. We'd be destroyed before we launched a single missile." "That's not what I meant," Mendez continued. "I mean something psychological, something cultural. Humans have always had a gift for that, haven't we? We tell stories, we inspire people, we find meaning in small gestures. Cross turned from the viewport. Go on. There's something in the historical database, Mendez said, her fingers flying across her console. I was reading through the archived records of Earth's great moments. When we were divided, when we seemed broken, small words and gestures changed everything. JFK's moon speech, Luther King's dream. They weren't military victories, but they transformed how people saw themselves and their possibilities. Okonkwo nodded slowly. Cultural disruption. If we could say something, do something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about us, we'd still be dead, Rivera interjected. Maybe, Cross said thoughtfully. But if we're going to die anyway, if we're going to submit to slavery or be erased, then maybe there's something to this. Maybe there's a third path that none of us have considered yet. He accessed the classified archives, moving through security protocols until he reached the section he'd been thinking about for weeks now. Deep in a vault on Lunar Station 7, there was a discovery that had been kept from the public. Archaeological teams had found something embedded in rock layers in the Australian outback. It was ancient, impossibly ancient. 15,000 years old, give or take. It was a metal disc, covered in symbols that perfectly matched linguistic patterns from human languages separated by continents and centuries. It shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. Yet it did. The analysis suggested only one possibility. Somewhere in humanity's deep past there had been contact. Some ancient civilization had passed through. They had left something behind, a message, a marker, a reminder. The symbols, when translated using cross-reference linguistic algorithms, formed a single concept repeated over and over in countless languages and scripts. That concept was, remember. Show them this, Cross said, pulling up the image of the artifact on the main screen. Tell them that humanity is not new to the galaxy, that we may be young as a spacefaring civilization, but we are old in spirit, that we have been here before in some form, and we have survived, and we will survive again. Okonkwo studied the artifact carefully. It's beautiful in its mystery, but Vextar will see it as irrelevant historical trivia. Then we don't show it to Vextar, Cross said quietly. We broadcast it to every species in the Sovereign Assembly. We let it travel through their information networks. We give them something to question. We give them doubt. As the hours counted down toward their deadline for response, Cross and his team worked in focused silence. They prepared their answer not with weapons or negotiations, but with something far more dangerous to a civilization built on absolute certainty. They prepared a single statement. One powerful word, carefully chosen, that would carry the weight of all human history, all human struggle, all human defiance. By the time the deadline arrived, Cross stood once again before the viewport. The Assembly flagship still hung in the void, waiting for submission. His team was arrayed behind him, united in purpose for the first time in this entire ordeal. Mendez opened the communication channel. Vextar's synthetic voice requested Earth's answer, and Cross began to speak. The word that changed everything. Commander Cross's voice came through the communication channel with crystalline clarity. Not with defiance or anger, but with something far more powerful, with absolute conviction. The word he spoke was simple. It was ancient. It was the foundation upon which all human achievement had ever been built. Remember, the transmission went out across every channel, to every connected system in the Sovereign Assembly's network. It wasn't just a word. It was accompanied by every piece of evidence humanity could gather. The ancient artifact from Earth's outback. Images of human history. Civilizations rising and falling, wars and peace, art and science and love and determination. It showed humanity not as primitives, but as inheritors of something vast and mysterious. It showed them as survivors, as seekers, as beings who had endured because something in their nature compelled them to move forward. For a long moment, there was silence on the communication channel. Then something unprecedented happened. Vextar spoke, but not with anger. With confusion. What is the meaning of this transmission? You've sent us historical data and a single word. This is not an answer to our demands. It is exactly the answer you need, Cross replied, his voice steady. You asked us to choose between submission, isolation, or destruction. We choose a fourth option. We choose to remind you, and every other species in your assembly, of something you've forgotten. In the Supreme Coordinator's chamber aboard the Assembly flagship, Vextar stood before a vast array of monitors displaying analysis data from 1,000 different sources. Intelligence officers combed through the transmission, searching for hidden weapons technology, secret military capabilities, anything that would explain the confidence in Cross's voice. They found nothing except the truth. Humans were indeed young. Their ship designs were relatively primitive by assembly standards. Their weapon systems were outdated. By every metric of military or technological power, they should have been terrified. Yet something was happening throughout the assembly's network. Word of humanity's single-word response was spreading, not through official channels, but through the organic flow of information that no government, no matter how powerful, could completely control. Species who had submitted centuries ago began asking questions. Species who had paid tribute for generations began wondering. The ancient Vortika, who had been conquered so long ago that their younger generations didn't even remember freedom, began accessing the human transmission. They shared it with the Carassian collective. The Carassians shared it with 36 other species. The word remember took on layers of meaning for each species that encountered it. For the Vortika, it was a reminder of what they had been before the assembly. For the Carassians, it was a mirror reflecting their own suppressed history. For dozens of other species, it became a catalyst for conversations they had been afraid to have. On Earth in the command center, Okonkwo watched the data flooding in with tears streaming down her face. "It's happening," she whispered. "It's actually working." She wasn't talking about military success or technological breakthrough. She was talking about something more fundamental. The ripple effects of that single word were disrupting the psychological foundation upon which the Sovereign Assembly had maintained control for 3,000 years. 20 minutes after the transmission, the first official challenge came. The Carassian government issued a formal statement, questioning whether the tribute levels demanded of their species were truly equitable. Within the hour, the Vortika demanded a complete audit of resources they had provided to the Assembly over the past 500 years. By the 6-hour mark, what had been a unified ancient hierarchy was fracturing, not into open rebellion but into something more dangerous to an absolute power structure, into doubt, into questions, into the realization that the young, primitive species from an insignificant world had somehow managed to say what thousands of conquered civilizations had never dared to speak. We remember, and we choose a different path. Vextar attempted damage control. The Supreme Coordinator issued statements declaring the human transmission to be propaganda and manipulation. But the more the Assembly's leadership tried to suppress the message, the more it spread. Information, once released into a networked civilization, could never be fully contained. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. A delegation of ambassadors from 37 species within the Sovereign Assembly requested an emergency session. They arrived not as supplicants seeking favor, but as a unified voice. They spoke of fairness and equity. They spoke of reconsidering the Assembly's fundamental approach to governance. They spoke of a galaxy where cooperation existed because it was mutually beneficial, not because smaller nations were forced into submission. This is because of a single word from a young species, one of the Assembly's ancient councils asked, their confusion evident. "No," replied Ambassador Krell of the Vonskian Federation, a species that had been under Assembly dominion for 2,000 years. "It is because a young species reminded us that we do not have to accept what we have been told to accept." That memory, the capacity to remember who we are and who we have been, is more powerful than any weapon, and that is something the Assembly cannot control. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The Sovereign Assembly didn't instantly dissolve or transform into a democratic utopia. That would have been too simple, too neat, too unbelievable. Instead, what happened was far more significant because it was real and messy and complicated. Negotiations began. The Assembly, faced with the possibility of a coalition of member species demanding reform, found itself in an unfamiliar position, vulnerable. For the first time in recorded history, its demands became negotiable. Resources required from subject species were reduced. Voluntary contributions replaced forced tributes. The military conscription demands disappeared entirely, replaced instead with voluntary alliance agreements. Was the transformation complete and perfect? No. There were still power imbalances, still inequities, still species and civilizations that possessed more than others. But the fundamental change was real. It was the difference between a tyranny and a federation. It was the difference between imposed order and negotiated peace. Cross received a message from Vextar 2 weeks after the transmission. The Supreme Coordinator didn't apologize. That would have been beneath his dignity and against his entire programming of superiority. Instead, he made a statement that in its own way was far more meaningful. The Sovereign Assembly acknowledges humanity's contribution to galactic discourse. Your species has demonstrated awareness of complex social dynamics and has successfully challenged our operational assumptions. We propose moving forward with Earth's incorporation into our community on revised terms. You will be treated as equals in our negotiations rather than as subjects to be absorbed. To those who hadn't been there, it might have seemed like a small thing. But to Cross and his team watching from the command center on Earth as the news spread across their world, it was everything. Human cities celebrated. Not with military triumph or the acquisition of wealth, but with something far deeper. The celebration of having been heard, of having spoken a truth that mattered, of having proven that size and age and firepower weren't everything in the cosmos. Dr. Okonkwo began researching what would become known throughout the galaxy as the human precedent. She documented exactly how a single word, backed by courage and knowledge of history, had disrupted an empire. She published her findings, and they were studied by revolutionary movements throughout the galaxy, by governments attempting to reform, by species working to break free from oppression. Some called it luck. Others called it a miracle. But Cross knew the truth. It was something far more powerful. It was the simple human capacity to refuse to accept the impossible. It was the ability to look at certain defeat and find a way through it. It was memory, the knowledge that humanity had endured before, through the mists of time, and that they would endure again. Years later, when other young species began achieving interstellar travel, they would often ask humanity for advice, and humanity's answer was always the same. Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. Remember that you have value not because of what you possess, but because of who you are. And never forget that the smallest voice in the room can change everything if that voice speaks truth. The ancient artifact from Earth's outback was placed in the Hall of Galactic Heritage. Next to it, a simple plaque bore Cross's transmission message. The single word "remember" was inscribed in 73 different languages, representing 73 species whose lives had been changed by it. In the vast galaxy of stars and endless civilizations, humanity had found its place not through conquest or submission, but through something that couldn't be measured in firepower or resources. They had found their place by reminding an ancient cosmos of something it had nearly forgotten, that every species deserves to be heard. That memory is sacred, that even the youngest voice might carry the oldest wisdom. And in the hearts of countless beings across countless worlds, the word echoed like a bell that could never be unrung, a reminder that the universe itself was waiting to be remembered, to be changed, to be transformed by those brave enough to speak the truth. Commander Cross stood once more at the viewport of the UNSS Revelation. But this time he was not looking at a predator in the void. He was looking at a partner, at the beginning of something new, at the promise of a galaxy where all voices, young and old, strong and small, mattered equally. And somewhere in the vast archive of human consciousness, stretching back 15,000 years or perhaps even further, that ancient civilization that had left their message in stone whispered across the ages, "Remember, and you shall inherit the stars."